The Barbary Pirates, or Barbary Corsairs, I use the term interchangeably, had a long history. They were so named because they operated from bases on the North African coast in an area that encompasses the northern coasts of what are now today called Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And at the time, the primary ethnic group present were known as Berbers, still are for that matter in large parts of that area, and a corruption of this term in European languages, switched E's for A's, and thus the Barbary Pirates were the result. As a vaguely organised group of raiders, they could actually trace their history back to the 8th century, shortly after the conquest of the area and the Iberian Peninsula by early waves of Islamic expansion. Their range was wide. The most obvious targets were Spanish and Portuguese coasts after the Reconquista, as they were the closest, but the Italian city-states, various Mediterranean islands, the southern French coast, and even the French Atlantic coast and southern coast of Britain were hit, as the pirates gained in confidence and size. By the 1500s, the various small states that collectively made up the Barbary coast were nominally under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And between nominal state backing, advances in ship technology, and a swell of new recruits, mostly, it has to be said, thanks to various European countries expelling various ethnic and religious groups who then turned out to, unsurprisingly, have something of an axe to grind as a result, the size and scope of the pirate raids took a huge leap, with entire islands and coastal towns raided and depopulated. For the Barbary Pirates took the phrase "steal everything not nailed down" quite literally, and they also took pry bars along to unnail some of the things that had been. Since humans are not generally, in most civilized societies, nailed down, this meant that a lot of slaves were taken along with their goods and belongings, and at times the primary purpose of these raids was slave-taking. This, in turn, led to a huge decline in coastal and island populations all along the European coastal areas that they mostly targeted, in some places to such a degree that many of those areas have not recovered the population level or density of settlement that they used to have, even to this day. Of course, the various European powers didn't exactly appreciate this, and numerous Dutch, English, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and other expeditions would be sent to try and suppress the problem, since, of course, shipping in transit across the seas near the states was also targeted. On the one hand, these missions were usually not too difficult, as pirate vessels were usually small, fast-moving raiders unsuited to standing up to even a small squadron of frigates. Their main strengths, large numbers and lots of boarding parties, being somewhat ineffective on the high seas against high-sided warships that were bristling with guns. On the other hand, though, each of these expeditions was usually concerned only with stopping attacks on their own ships and coasts. The Barbary States were numerous, usually centred on a particularly large port city, and so an English expedition that secured compliance from, say, the kingdoms of Tunis and Tripoli, as happened in 1675, would have no effect on raids on English holdings or shipping that came from Morocco or Algiers. And the first two states were still perfectly at liberty to raid anything else that wasn't English. Laying siege to and then occupying the whole North African coast was seen as non-viable, even by Spain, the closest major power, and sooner or later, even pirate states that had agreed to peace would decide that, well, the attention had gone off them enough, or possibly the power in question was otherwise occupied with a larger war, and they'd start raiding everything in sight equally once again. As a result, many of the treaties that were established were in the form of tribute treaties. A gift payment would be made once the treaty was signed, and then a smaller sum would be remitted to the pirate state every year, which could be made up of money, goods, or a mixture of the two, in order for the ships of that nation to not be attacked. Of course, in the interest of getting even more money out of people, the Barbary States would often use the slightest pretense to say that the treaty had been broken and everything was back on again, and that if you wanted peace again, well, you'd have to pay another big peace settlement and negotiate a slightly higher price of tribute. All of this is, however, a brief summary of something that we might come to revisit in more detail at some point in the future. The main topic for today is what happened to the Barbary Pirates in the last half-century or so of their existence. For this, we go to 1783 and an entire ocean away as our starting point, at least briefly. The power of the Royal Navy on a war footing had for some time deterred the Barbary corsairs from going after ships flying British flags. But in the closing stages of this particular year, the United States of America was recognised as an independent nation with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. This meant many things, but for the purposes of this video, it meant that American ships flying the Stars and Stripes would now be recognised the world over as operating under the auspices and protections of the US government and the US government alone. The next year, in 1784, the corsairs of Morocco spotted a small ship, the brig Betsy, flying the said flag, and since there was no treaty with or fear of this new government and nation amongst the pirates, the ship was duly swarmed, seized, and the crew held to ransom. As we'll see later, this would actually prove to be a relatively soft introduction for the United States when it came to dealing with the Barbary Pirates. Others would be far less accommodating. Having just finished a war with the British Empire, the United States now immediately sought a commercial treaty that would place its merchant fleet under the same protections of the Royal Navy as they had previously enjoyed. The British response, after some redrafting from an initial response that presumably consisted of several pages of the words, ha 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 ha, yeah right, in multiple forms, changed over to a note that described the proposal as not being in Britain's commercial interests. Well, that kind of put paid to that idea. France proved more amenable to offering the American ships protection under its umbrella, but since at the time the Anglo-French War of 1778 to 1783 had just concluded at ruinous cost to the French treasury, a lot of French warships were now under new British ownership, and the knock-on effects of all of this was spiralling France towards revolution, which by this point was less than 5 years away. That French umbrella had an awful lot of holes in it. This was exemplified when, in 1785, Thomas Jefferson was extolling the principles of free trade to the rest of the world, whilst at almost the same moment, pirates from Algiers were happily interpreting this to mean the passage of American ships, goods, and crew freely into their hands at gunpoint. The British, it must be said, were revelling in a chance for some petty revenge, and widely circulated reports of these seizures as matters of concern to everybody in the region. But, of course, there wasn't anything they could do something about, since, of course, the ships in question were flying an independent flag and thus did not come under their protection. This had the result of amplifying the perceived threat to American shipping, vastly in excess of the number of ships that had actually been seized at this point, and the insurance rates for any ship flying the American flag trying to enter the Mediterranean region, or even going near the Mediterranean, jumped 20-fold. Instantly crippling American commerce in the region, even if the ships weren't attacked, since it was now completely unaffordable and uncompetitive to even start thinking about a voyage into the area. This wasn't helped by Congress, who saw that one coming, who, upon the start of the negotiations that had resulted in the Treaty of Paris, had immediately begun selling off the Continental Navy, the predecessor to the United States Navy, and within the space of 2 years after the 1783 treaty was signed, supported by the free trade advocating Jefferson, the fledgling country had precisely zero capability to exercise the defence of its merchant fleet overseas. Weirdly, Jefferson would continue to operate mutually contradictory standpoints of both arguing for war against the pirates, but also utterly opposing any measures that were put forward that would give the USA the means to actually fight said war. Anyway, Morocco turned out, as we mentioned earlier, to be a surprisingly easy problem to solve. They actually wanted a treaty with the United States, and the seizing of the Betsy had been an act of aggrievement to get them to pay attention, since on and off negotiations to try and get some form of treaty from the US had been going on since almost the Declaration of Independence. And so, a treaty of friendship, signed in 1786, largely resolved that problem, albeit that a few independent pirates operating from that state's ports would continue to be a low-level nuisance from time to time. As France finally collapsed into full-on revolution and then emerged from that to start the Napoleonic Wars, the Barbary Pirates took their chance to resume preying on weaker and more vulnerable targets notionally under the auspices of various European states. But with large volumes of warships of all sorts of flags sailing back and forth, Due to the war, these longer-form expeditions were decidedly more risky for the pirates. Plus, more and more coastal fortifications were being thrown up, and those were just as good at dealing with pirate ships as they were at shooting at full-on warships. Nonetheless, the pirates adjusted their tribute arrangements to compensate. Spain, for example, was in the same year that the Algerine pirates kicked off their campaign against US shipping, required to pay not just financial tribute, but also to supply enough cannon and ammunition to outfit a flotilla of pirate vessels, as well as stock up on their small arms supply and ammunition loads. It should not be imagined either that all of this was a loosely organised collection of ruffians. The pirate operations were smoothly run and well funded. Indeed, calling them pirates is more a reflection on their overall behaviour. Technically, they were either an arm of the state or potentially privateers, since they did actually work for rulers of cities, and these rulers were recognised as sovereign entities. The pirate attacks themselves were effectively largely state-managed, and each individual expedition was often advertised, with various locals buying shares, which helped pay for the crew and the supplies, and in exchange they received a proportionate share of any profits when the ship or ships returned, hopefully with some very nice captured ships. The vessels themselves were often by this stage either captured vessels that had been refitted as raiders, or purpose-built ships that had been exacted as another form of specifically useful tribute. Smaller outrider vessels more closely resembled the galleys of old, but the pirate fleets overall were a wide mix of almost every shipbuilding tradition that could be found across the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds. Still, 1785 seemed to offer some hope to the American merchant sailors, as France and Spain announced a joint expedition against Algiers, the primary of the Barbary States. And the Royal Navy, whilst not endorsing the attack, was sending 5 ships of the line and 4 frigates to watch what was going on. Soon enough, the newspapers began to report the destruction of the pirate city, and American merchants flooded back to the rich trading grounds. But upon arrival, they found the Mediterranean under a state of almost martial law. Merchant ships sailed under military protection from their respective navies. American ships, which had no navy to defend them, stuck out even more now, and pirate ships descended on them in a frenzy. What had actually happened is that the Algerines had lured the Franco-Spanish forces deep into the harbour, and then turned on the attackers in the confined waters. Instead of an extermination, the attack had ended in a treaty between France, Spain, and Algiers, and the enrichment of Algiers in the form of a large upfront tribute, and of course a standard treaty promising even more tribute going forward. Indeed, overall, Algiers, as the kingpin of the Barbary States, would prove to be a much tougher foe than Morocco, whose ruler generally just wanted to benefit from trade as much as he did from piracy, whereas the ruler of Algiers was perfectly happy with the income streams he generated from piracy and tribute that others paid to prevent it. Since the US had no navy to oppose him, and in attempted negotiations to secure the release of captured American crews it also became clear they didn't have the money to pay him off either, he saw no problem in enriching himself at the expense of American goods, American ships, and of course, once the crew had been captured, American slaves. This all set off a massive set of arguments back over in Washington. Everyone agreed the US government would have to raise some money, but the split was over what was it to be spent on. Should it be spent on a navy to force the Algerine government to come to terms, which would be a higher upfront cost, but with longer-term savings, or should they simply pay off the pirates, which would cost less immediately, but represented a fairly substantial ongoing cost that might then stretch on indefinitely? At this point, Congress also lacked the ability to levy ongoing taxes across all states, and also lacked the power to pass laws regulating commerce, which further compounded any decision or treaty that might be entered into. All the while, the delays caused the price demanded by the Algiers rulers to increase by a couple of orders of magnitude. To add even more problems to the pot, various European powers were in the process of negotiating their own renewed treaties with the Corsairs, which then allowed them to slacken off military escorts and also still further isolated American shipping as easy pickings, since the European merchant ships were now by and large protected both by the word of the Algiers government and the other Barbary states, as well as by the occasional warship. In large part, it was these exact tensions that drove much of the pressure behind the writing of the new US Constitution in 1787, which would now allow Congress to make laws and treaties that regulated commerce and raised taxes for all states in the Union, and also granted them the power to build and maintain a national military, which in this context meant a navy. Of course, the ratification and negotiation process that followed took quite some time, and the Barbary Pirates continued their predations, even as the 1780s turned into the 1790s and constitutional arguments raged over in the USA. This was further complicated with the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, which made the sea lanes even more dangerous. 1791 saw the death of the Algiers ruler, and his successor followed the age-old practice of demanding presents and gifts from all the powers that he had inherited a treaty with in order to allow their treaty to continue. Most of Europe duly found itself sending even more money, guns, and ships, and other useful products to Algiers, with the exception of the UK, whose navy the new ruler had taken one look at, and then promptly sent a renewed treaty to London with no further request for additional payment. The other exception was France, which was merrily in the process of guillotining everyone in sight, and thus was not in a position to do much of anything. Albeit that this did mean that French ships were soon added to the list of acceptable piratical targets. The overall flow of income and warlike material strengthened the pirates, who were then able to conclude a treaty with Portugal, who, for a few years, had agreed to protect American vessels against piratical assaults, and thus largely confined the problem to the Mediterranean itself. But in 1793, with peace concluded, the Portuguese navy had no choice but to stand back and watch as 8 Algerine ships headed through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic, looking for American vessels. Within a month, another 11 American ships and their crews had found themselves as unwilling guests under the guns of the port of Algiers. This sharp increase in merchant casualties finally prompted a response, and in 1794 2 measures were authorised: the construction of 6 frigates for defence of American interests, but, in the interim, an even larger amount was requisitioned to pay off the Algerine pirates in the hopes of unlocking commercial opportunities, which seemed to be even more lucrative for a neutral carrier as Europe spiralled towards war and the larger navies began hoovering up merchant ships from those powers that they were fighting against, and thus forcing any remaining merchant ships to act in slower, much less wieldy convoys. Towards the end of the year, then, a treaty was concluded with Algiers, agreeing to the payment of $600,000, 20% more than had been voted on to build the entire brand new United States Navy, along with a further agreement to pay an annual tribute valued at $40,000 in a mixture of money, guns, and other material. However, there were a number of additional expenses involved, such as presents and such like, and this was just the price of peace starting from the date of signing. In order to secure the release of the Americans that had already been taken prisoner, there was an additional $200,000 demanded, and the exact nature of the tribute was specified as mostly taking the form of naval supplies and materials, which would have to be manufactured or procured, and this also included the building of a 36-gun frigate, the Algerian ruler apparently having decided to use the treaty to turn the United States into a kind of remote-operated shipyard to further his piratical endeavours. However, this did not come without benefits. Whilst the initial costs of the treaty would be the single largest budget item on the United States government's agenda for 1795, it was estimated that between the ability to trade freely and the lower insurance costs of such trade, the US economy would recover about 150% of the initial $600,000 payment each year, which was a substantial shot in the arm for the US economy at the time, even accounting for the slightly smaller ongoing cost of the annual tribute. Of course, not all of that money would find its way back into federal hands, but it was viewed in terms of the overall ability of the country to gain wealth. Separate treaties agreed in the same year with Spain and the United Kingdom seemed to further point to a bright future for American trade, so much so that Congress immediately moved to suspend work on the nascent United States Navy. Only the USS United States, USS Constitution, and USS Constellation were to be completed, for the most part. The other 3 ships would remain incomplete on the stocks due to lack of funding. The entire endeavour almost ended up foundering anyway, as Congress then descended into political infighting over how to actually get the money raised, and it took 18 months for the required payments to make their way over the ocean, during which time Algiers had made it clear that the treaty would not be enacted until the money had been received. A brig, 2 schooners, and the 36-gun frigate all had to be expedited just to stop the pirates renouncing the whole thing on grounds of lack of payment, which led to the ironic position of US shipyards building a larger naval force, at least numerically, for the Algiers pirates than they were building for the entire United States Navy at one point in 1796. Between this, yellow fever in the US, and increasing conflict between Britain and France on the high seas, it would not be until the start of 1798 that the ships, naval hardware, supplies, and money, at an eventual all-up cost of about $1 million, finally entered the Bay of Algiers. In parallel with this were attempts to secure peace with the last 2 Barbary States, Tunis and Tripoli, and in this they found themselves with an unlikely ally, Algiers itself, and treaties that totalled about $200,000 plus naval equipment, presents, and an outfitted brig for Tunis were signed, along with a modest annual tribute agreement each, which now in theory meant that American shipping was safe from the depredations of all the Barbary kingdoms. Some of the tribute money was even coming back to America, as Algiers' ruler had ordered 2 more frigates from American yards, something that was allowed after some disquiet had been expressed, since on the one hand it would make Algiers a more powerful force, but on the other it did seem unlikely that he would try and break the treaty whilst 2 ships were under construction that might be seized and his investment lost. However, in the late 1790s, the Quasi-War with France drew the attention of the small American navy away from the Mediterranean, and, realising that the American merchant fleet was once again without protection, and having made some estimates on the increased wealth of the country based on the number of American ships that had now been arriving in the ostensibly safe Mediterranean waters, some slights, real and others imagined, were used by all 3 Barbary states with treaties of tribute to start going after the American shipping once again. Although galling, the USN could not do anything immediately, as the French were seizing American ships at 10 times the rate of the Barbary corsairs, and so they were the priority focus. The fact that, unlike the distant pirates, some French ships were actually taking US ships not just off the US coast but within US harbours themselves further explains that particular priority assignment. As a result, the remaining 3 frigates from the original order would be recommenced, new warships were ordered, and the temporary conversion of some merchant vessels into warships was also undertaken. This would eventually bring the Quasi-War to an end in America's favour, but taking their eye off the ball in the Mediterranean had found them in debt to the tune of $290,000, partly due to back payments and partially due to increased demands for tribute, with Algiers even going as far as to demand one of the new 74-gun ships of the line that Congress had authorised for the United States Navy in lieu of a portion of the owed debt. As it turned out, those particular 74-gunners were cancelled, and Algiers would never get its ship of the line. But nonetheless, as the 18th century turned into the 19th, humiliation continued to pile up. The frigate USS George Washington arrived with tribute payments in Algiers that year, and was then ordered to take aboard tribute payment that Algiers owed in turn to the Ottoman Sultan, and to take the Algiers cargo to the Ottoman Sultan, flying an Algerine flag. Captain Bainbridge wanted to refuse, but he was one small ship alone under the guns of the port, and with no support in the offing, he had little other choice, and the crew was forced to watch as a United States warship had its colours pulled down by pirates and replaced before being sent on an errand for a foreign power. Tripoli then expelled the American consul when their demands for increased tribute were rejected, and threatened to go back to raiding if their demands were not also met. Eventually, they would declare war, and in 1801, the greatly expanded American trade in the Mediterranean was once again under threat. Jefferson, who had at this point just been elected president, was now in the odd position of sending a navy whose creation he had bitterly opposed to fight the war that he'd spent years calling for. 3 frigates and a schooner were dispatched, but no smaller craft with shallow draft to work inside a harbour were sent, partially on the grounds of economy. They also sailed with a very restrictive set of rules of engagement. They were allowed to defend American ships, but they were not allowed to undertake any offensive actions of any sort. The ships in question, USS President, Philadelphia, Essex and Enterprise, duly arrived in summer 1801, and USS Enterprise promptly captured one of the Tripolian raiders. But without authorization to take prizes, they were then forced to release the surviving crew and the ship, although they did at least make sure to throw all the guns over the side first. This prompted the usual political mudslinging back at home, but by 1802, the US Navy formation was finally granted the authority to act as actual warships in full, which allowed them to promptly enforce a blockade on Tripoli itself. Unfortunately, in the absence of shallow draft vessels, the lighter of the pirate craft was able to maintain supply runs and the occasional raid on American merchant ships by simply sailing out over shallow shoals where the oceanic-dwelling US Navy warships could not follow. 5 new ships arrived to relieve the original force, but the lack of progress began to embolden the other pirate states. Tunis and Algiers began to escalate threats and demands, and even Morocco, heretofore friendly, began hostilities. The latter because the US had refused to allow Moroccan grain ships to continue trade with Tripoli whilst it remained under blockade. By autumn, the blockade had collapsed and had been abandoned in favour of a much more defensively minded measure, the warships providing convoy escort to American merchant ships sailing through the contested waters. But as the war continued and costs mounted, the American squadron was drawn down for the winter. The US considered how best to regroup, and by spring 1803 more ships and a new commander, Edward Preble, were sent out with a promise to finally commission and dispatch the shallow draft attack vessels that would be needed to close the blockade in completely. Unfortunately, whilst awaiting their arrival, a rather famous incident developed. Captain Bainbridge was now in charge of USS Philadelphia and determined to run down a pirate vessel, but all this accomplished was running his own ship aground in the shallows, and soon enough the frigate was swarmed by smaller craft from Tripoli and forced to surrender. Philadelphia was then hauled into the harbour and work began on turning it into another powerful pirate ship. However, with some help from a coded letter from Bainbridge, who was in prison in the harbour itself, Preble instructed one Lieutenant Decatur, commanding USS Enterprise, to destroy the Philadelphia rather than let it remain in enemy hands. In furtherance of this goal, Enterprise captured a small Tripolian ship, renamed it Intrepid, and stocked it with combustible material. After some practice in boarding a US frigate conducted away from the enemy's port, the Intrepid snuck in under the cover of night, pretended to be a local vessel, and then boarded the Philadelphia and set it on fire. Now, under fire from some of the defenders, the Intrepid received one last bit of help from Philadelphia when the latter ship's magazines exploded, providing sufficient distraction to allow the smaller vessel to slip out safely. 1804 saw the arrival of the shallow draft attack vessels that US commanders had been requesting for at least 18 months finally imminent, and so a series of American assaults were begun to eat away at the strength of Tripoli's fleet and defences, although not without cost. The Intrepid was sent in again, this time as a fire ship loaded with several £1,000s of explosives designed to be set off against the walls of the ruler's castle. But it was intercepted a few hundred yards short of the target, and the crew chose to set off the explosives rather than face capture. This series of assaults was coupled with an agreement with Hamet, the brother of the ruler of Tripoli, who was named Yusuf, to launch a joint land and sea offensive that would oust the current ruler. In return, Hamet promised a much more lenient treaty. This campaign started by taking the smaller port of Derna in an operation that was conducted with Hamet's men in accordance with the ships Argus, Hornet, Nautilus, and their complement of marines. But it turned out this was as far as it went for the moment. The US forces off of Tripoli itself finally managed to secure a treaty with Yusuf, the current ruler, and Hamet was forced to leave the kingdom again, albeit with a promise to have his family restored to him, as they'd been taken as hostages by his brother some years earlier. However, as Tripoli was a country as well as a city, the assault on Derna did have one lasting effect. The battle is the cause of the line "To the Shores of Tripoli" in the US Marines anthem, since Marine forces obviously took part in the assault. This treaty was far more favourable to the US than the previous one had been. No more tribute was to be exacted, although $60,000 was needed to get the Philadelphia's crew back, and the whole affair immediately descended into political wrangling back home, whilst the increasing pace of the Napoleonic Wars overtook most naval news in the Mediterranean. In particular, both major parties involved, the UK and France, refused to recognise any idea of neutral trading rights for US shipping, which, with Napoleon's conquest of most of Europe, suddenly meant that most of the ports in the Mediterranean were closed off to US merchant ships. The British blockade of Europe also cut down on the amount of shipping generally available, which thus cut into the income of various Barbary States, and over the next few years, this would send them looking for ways of targeting what shipping remained active, regardless of whether or not there technically was a pre-existing treaty in place with that particular nation. It was in fact in this context that the Leopard affair took place. USS Chesapeake was on its way to ensure the Corsairs were actually following the various treaties established with them when it refused to hand over deserters from a British ship who had re-enlisted with the United States Navy, on the grounds that some of them were, perhaps dubiously, perhaps actually, American citizens. Whilst the exact details of that particular back and forth are more relevant to the War of 1812, it ended up with Leopard firing upon Chesapeake, damaging it badly enough to force the handover of the deserters and forcing the ship itself to go back to port for repairs. Its failure to arrive and take up a patrol station in the Mediterranean only emboldened the various Barbary States as American merchant ships sailed past their coasts, and by 1807 this had escalated to outright assaults once more, as spiralling tensions with the British had caused a recall of all remaining US ships in the Mediterranean, and soon enough the pirate states found themselves demanding tribute to prevent any further captures. This meant that the United States fell back on having to pay small amounts of tribute again, as there was precious little else that they could do, especially once the US ended up fighting the War of 1812 and needed every ship that it could simply to try and hold on to the US coastline. The only bright spot, if it can be called that, was that the Embargo Act of 1807 and subsequent follow-on acts meant that most US merchant ships were stuck at home anyway, so there wasn't all that much shipping out there to protect in any case. Of course, once the War of 1812 broke out, it was clear to the Barbary States that the US was not going to be able to devote any resources to stop them, and so Algiers promptly launched a series of attacks on what US merchant ships it could find. Of course, with the Treaty of Ghent ending the war at the end of 1814, it meant that attention could once more be visited upon the pirate states after they'd had a few years of happy raiding. As it was recognised that renewed trade was vital to help rebuild the devastated American economy, barely 3 months after the war with the British had been concluded, war on Algiers was declared, and 10 ships headed out promptly, followed by even more shortly thereafter, bringing the total up to 17, including a number of powerful frigates built during the War of 1812. Sweeping into the Gibraltar Straits, the squadron rapidly took a pair of Algerine warships and headed for the capital city itself. Sailing into the bay and finding the state in a state of chaos, from a spate of near-Roman levels of assassination and replacement at the highest levels, the American fleet was able to force a treaty mostly on American terms that included no tribute to be paid anymore. This accomplished, the fleet moved on and likewise forced an agreement from the powers ruling in Tunis, and then finally on to Tripoli, where in addition they also managed to force the release of all foreign prisoners and slaves. Whilst at the time the events of the Waterloo campaign overshadowed these achievements in most newspapers, it was noticed enough to start changing attitudes amongst the European powers to the Barbary States, and fewer states agreed to renew tribute when their treaties came up for renewal. The changing opinion on slavery was also a factor, as the pirate states still conducted both it in general and slave raids in particular, and with the British having been left masters of the seas in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, British patrols as well as other European vessels combined with the choking off of tribute lines to start to impoverish the previously rich North African states. Indeed, the habits of the Barbary States to break treaties to try and secure even better terms for themselves resulted more and more often in squadrons of warships stopping by to enforce the original terms by force, or even exact better terms for the European state in question. In 1816, a British and Dutch fleet sailed into the Bay of Algiers, and when one Barbary gunner fired upon the force, the flagship, the relatively new first-rate Queen Charlotte under the command of one Edward Pellew, yes, that one, cut loose with all the firepower that was accorded to a ship of her size, supported by the rest of the fleet, with cannon shot, mortar bombs, and rockets. The entire Algerine fleet, bar 2 vessels, was sunk. Queen Charlotte herself accounted for over 24 small enemy ships which had made an en masse attempt at boarding her, and almost all the defences were violently demolished and parts of the town set ablaze. This was enough to force the ruler of Algiers to accept British terms, and the threat that they posed subsided for quite a while. But eventually the town was rebuilt, and eventually everything kicked off again. In 1824, Algiers would be bombarded again by a British squadron, and then, having pushed their luck too far once too often, the whole area was invaded and taken over by the French in 1830, cutting off that state's access to the sea for good. Similar assaults by the British and French on Tunis and Tripoli saw the former transition over to a more commercial form of trade during the 1820s and 30s, whilst the latter would be formally annexed by the Ottomans in the latter part of the 1830s, following similar assaults, and that cut off the threat from those two states as well. The last holdouts were the Moroccans, or more specifically the group known as the Reef Pirates, who had grown somewhat out of the control of the Sultan of Morocco himself. And the 1830s and 1840s had seen a somewhat familiar pattern develop, wherein a merchant ship would be taken, a warship would come to rescue it, if it could, the pirates would flee inland, some poor town or port on the coast would be shot up, and the merchant ship and its crew, if they were still alive, would be retrieved, and the whole process would start over again a little bit later on. But by 1848, the actions of this last holdout of Barbary piracy had reached something of a tipping point, and Admiral Sir Charles Napier descended on the Moroccan coastline with a small fleet. Whilst a British ship and some captives were rescued, the pirates melted away once again into the landscape, and despite scouring the coast, little worth shooting at was found. And so it went back to a roughly biannual routine of a warship coming in to rescue the survivors of the latest piracy, shooting at some pirates, and then departing with what they could salvage. But each rescue was coming at a greater and greater cost to the pirates. A sail-powered vessel with solid-shot cannon could do some damage and inflict some casualties, but as this time period went on, the Royal Navy ships gradually became steam-powered, and thus much more able to get in close to the coast much faster, and the guns themselves were becoming larger and larger shell guns, armed with explosive and canister shells, which were much more capable of scything down large numbers of exposed pirates, and thus each encounter was costing the pirates more and more of their numbers. Nonetheless, the waters off the northwest African coast would remain somewhat dangerous until 1859, when Spain took the offending part of the coast as part of its war with Morocco. Whilst the area would remain rebellious well into the 20th century, overall, this marked the fall of the last outpost of what had once been a 1,000-year-old network of piratical states, ranging from the Atlantic to halfway to Egypt, and the Barbary pirates passed into history, at least for the most part.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.